Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything media network. Founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, we start chapter 31 of this textbook, page 770 of 1007. We're almost there. This is chapter 31, which is titled World War II and its Aftermath. Pivotal. 1931 to 1955 is the chapter's scope. Section 1 of this chapter: aggression, appeasement, and war. Setting the scene. During the 1920s, the Western democracies tried to strengthen the framework for peace. In the 1930s, that structure crumbled. Dictators in Spain, Germany, and Italy, along with militarists in Japan, pursued ambitious goals for empire. They scorned peace and glorified war. Unlike these dictators, leaders of the Western democracies were haunted by memories of the Great War. Spurred by voters who demanded no more war, the leaders of Britain, France, and the United States tried to avoid conflict through diplomacy. During the 1930s, the two sides tested each other's commitment and will. I need to get some sunglasses, pardon. New heading. Please, my name is John Michael. Please like and subscribe. Please. I'm almost done with the textbook. That means that I start something new after the textbook, which will be just kind of a more standard podcast format. Maybe I'll read another textbook if somebody mails one to me. But it has to be very outdated. Preferably like almost an antique textbook. One that goes from like maybe the 50s or something, or the 60s. Maybe that's valuable, but I would read it on the internet if you send it. So thank you. Dictators challenge the world. Dictators challenge world peace. Challenges of peace followed a pattern throughout 1930s. Dictators took aggressive action, but met only verbal protests and pleas for peace from democracies. Mussolini and Hitler viewed that desire for peace as weakness and responded with new acts of aggression. With hindsight, we can see the shortcomings of the democracy's policies. We must remember, however, that these policies were the product of long and careful deliberation. At the time, people strongly believed that they would work. Japan on the move. One of the earliest tests had been posed by Japan. Japanese military leaders and ultranationalists thought that Japan should have an empire equal to those of the Western powers. In pursuit of the goal, Japan seized Manchuria in 1931. When the League of Nations condemned the aggression, Japan withdrew from the organization. Japan's easy success strengthened militarists. In 1937, Japanese armies overran much of eastern China. Once again, Western protests had no effect on the conqueror. Italy invades Ethiopia. In Italy, Mussolini used his new modern military to pursue his own imperialist ambitions. He looked first to Ethiopia in northeastern Africa. Italy's defeat by the Ethiopians in the Battle of Adowa in 1896 still rankled. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Although Ethiopians resisted bravely, their outdated weapons were no match for Mussolini's tanks, machine guns, poison gas, and aeroplanes. Ethiopian King Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations for help. The League voted sanctions or penalties against Italy for having violated international law. But the League had no power to enforce the sanctions, and by early 1936, Italy had conquered Ethiopia. Hitler's challenge. By then, Hitler too had tested the will of Western democracies and found it weak. First, he built up the German military in defiance of the Versailles Treaty. Then, in 1936, he sent troops to the demilitarized Rhineland bordering France, another treaty violation. Germans hated Versailles Treaty, and Hitler's successful challenge won him greater popularity at home. Western democracies denounced his move but took no real action. Instead, they adopted a policy of appeasement against. Instead, they adopted a policy of appeasement, giving in to demands of aggressor to keep the peace. Appeasement and neutrality. The Western policy of appeasement developed for a number of reasons. France was demoralized. Suffering from political divisions at home, it could not move against Hitler without British support. The British, however, had no desire to confront the German dictator. Some even thought that Hitler's actions constituted a justifiable response to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which they believed had been too harsh against Germany. In both Britain and France, many saw Hitler and fascism as a defense against the worst evil, the spread of Soviet communism. Additionally, the Great Depression sapped the energies of Western democracies. Finally, widespread pacifism, or opposition to all war and disgust with destruction during the previous war, pushed many governments to seek peace at any price. As war clouds gathered in Europe in the mid-1930s, the United States Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. One law forbade the sale of arms to any nation at war. Others outlawed loans to warring nations and prohibited Americans from traveling in ships of warring powers. The fundamental goal of American policy, however, was to avoid involvement in European war, not to prevent such a conflict. Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo axis. In the face of democracy's weakness, Germany, Italy, and Japan formed what became known as the Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo Axis. The Axis powers agreed to fight Soviet communism. They also agreed to not interfere with one another's plans for expansion. The agreement cleared the way for these anti-democratic aggressor powers to take even bolder steps. The Spanish Civil War. New heading. In 1936, Spain plunged into a civil war. Although Spanish Civil War was a local struggle, it soon drew other European powers into fighting. From monarchy to republic. In the 1920s, Spain was a monarchy dominated by land-owning upper class, the Catholic Church, and the military. Most Spaniards were poor peasants or urban workers. In 1931, public unrest against old order forced the king to leave Spain. A republic was set up with a new, more liberal constitution. The Republican government passed a series of controversial reforms. It took over some church lands and ended church control of education. It redistributed some land to peasants, gave women the vote, and ended some privileges of the old ruling class. Spanish public opinion was divided. Leftists demanded more radical reforms. Conservatives who were backed by military rejected change. Although most Spaniards wanted peaceful democracy, clashes between leftists and rightists created chaos. Nationalists versus loyalists. In 1936, conservative general named Francisco Franco led a revolt that touched off the bloody Civil War. Fascists and supporters of right-wing policies rallied to the banner of Franco's forces, called nationalists. Supporters of the Republic, known as loyalists, included communists, socialists, supporters of democracy. Socialist supporters of democracy. A dress rehearsal. Both sides committed horrible atrocities. The ruinous struggle took almost 1 million lives. One of the worst horrors was a German air raid on Guernica, a small Spanish market town that lacked any military value. One April morning in 1937, German bombers streaked over the market square. They dropped their load of bombs and then swooped low to machine gun anyone in the streets who had survived the first attack. An estimated 1,600 innocent people were killed. To Nazi leaders, the attack on Guernica was an experiment to identify what the new planes could do. To the world, it was a grim warning of the destructive power of modern warfare. In 1939, Franco had triumphed. Once in power, he created fascist dictatorship like those of Hitler and Mussolini. He rolled back earlier reforms, killed and jailed enemies, and used terror to promote order. So who did the Guernica? Worst? A German air raid on. Wait, why did German? Oh, is that what it says? 37 violent Italy, Western democracies joined the brigade, fought against. So the Germans and the Italians, the Soviets, and Western democracies joined the International Brigade and fought alongside the Loyalists against fascism. The government of Britain, France, and the United States, however, remained neutral. And then German bombers in 1939, on the side of the Loyalists, bombed Guernica. And who is Franco? Is he loyalist or is he the other one? Okay, so fascists and supporters of right-wing policies rallied to the banner of Franco's forces called nationalists. Supporters of the Republic, known as loyalists, included communists, socialists, and supporters of democracy. Okay, so I guess it was again the other side that bombed Guernica, not Franco's side. Franco being the totalitarian leader, fascist leader that took over, that led for God knows how long, into the 70s, I think. German aggression continues. In the meantime, Hitler pursued his goal of bringing all German-speaking people into the Third Reich. He also took steps to gain living space for Germans in Eastern Europe. Hitler, who believed in the superiority of the Aryan race, thought that Germany had the right to conquer the inferior Slavs to the east. Nature is cruel, he claimed, so we may be cruel too. I have the right to remove millions of an inferior race that breeds like vermin. Austria annexed. From the beginning, Nazi propaganda had found fertile ground in Austria. By 1938, Hitler was ready to engineer the Anschluss, or Union of Austria and Germany. Earlier that year, he forced the Austrian chancellor to appoint Nazis to key cabinet posts. When the Austrian leader balked at the demands, Hitler sent in the German army to preserve order. To indicate his new role as ruler of Austria, Hitler made a speech from the Hofburg Palace, the former residence of the Habsburg emperors. The Anschluss violated the Treaty of Versailles and created a brief war scare, but Hitler quickly silenced any Austrians who had opposed him. And since the Western democracies took no action, Hitler easily had his way. The Czech crisis. Germany's next victim was Czechoslovakia. At first, Hitler insisted that the 3 million Germans in the Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia, be given autonomy. The demand set off new alarms among the democracies. Czechoslovakia was one of only 2 remaining democracies in Eastern Europe. Finland was the other. Still, Britain and France were not willing to go to war to save it. As British and French leaders searched for a peaceful solution, Hitler increased his demands. The Sudetenland, he said, must be annexed to Germany. At the Munich Conference in September 1938, British and French leaders again chose appeasement. They caved to the Hitler's demands and then persuaded the Czechs to surrender the Sudetenland without a fight. In exchange, Hitler assured Britain and France that he had no further plans to expand his territory. Peace of our time. Returning to Munich, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain told cheering crowds that he had achieved peace in our time. To Parliament, he declared that the Munich Pact had saved Czechoslovakia from destruction and Europe from Armageddon. French leader Eduardo Daladier had his different reaction to the joyous crowds greeted him in Paris. "The fools! Why are they cheering?" he asked. The Czech crisis revealed the Nazi menace. British politician Winston Churchill, who had long warned of the Nazi threat, judged the diplomats harshly. They had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They will have war. Europe plunges towards war. Just as Churchill predicted, Munich did not bring peace. Instead, Europe plunged rapidly towards war. In March 1939, Hitler gobbled up the rest of Czechoslovakia. The democracies finally accepted the fact that appeasement had failed. At last, thoroughly alarmed, they promised to protect Poland. Most likely the next target of Hitler's expansion. Nazi-Soviet Pact. In August 1939, Hitler stunned the world by announcing a non-aggression pact with his great enemy Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator publicly, the Nazi-Soviet Pact bound Hitler and Stalin to peaceful relations. Secretly, the two agreed not to fight if the other went to war and to divide up Poland and other parts of Western Europe. Hitler found the pact was based not on friendship or respect, but on mutual need. Hitler feared communism as Stalin feared fascism, but Hitler wanted a free hand in Poland. He also did not want to fight in a war with the Western democracies and the Soviet Union at the same time. For his part, Stalin had sought allies among the Western democracies against the Nazi menace. Mutual suspicion, however, kept them apart. By joining with Hitler, Stalin bought time to build up Soviet defenses. He also saw a chance for important territorial gains. Invasion of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, a week after the Nazi-Soviet Pact, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France honored their commitment to Poland and declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. One British poet caught the overwhelming mood of the gloom in these lines. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. W.H. Auden, in memory of W.B. Yeats. Why war came? Many factors contributed to the outbreak of World War II. You have learned some of the reasons behind Axis aggression. You have also seen why Western democracies adopted a policy of appeasement. Today, historians often see the war as an effort to revise the 1919 peace settlement. The Treaty of Versailles had divided much of the world into two camps, those who were satisfied with the terms that came and those who were not. Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union all felt betrayed or excluded by the settlement. Since 1939, people have debated issues such as why the Western democracies failed to respond forcefully to Nazi threat, and whether they could have stopped Hitler if they had responded. Dreading war, the democracies hoped that diplomacy and compromise would right old wrongs and prevent further aggression. They were distracted by their own political and economic problems and misread Hitler's intentions. Most disregarded even Hitler's declared goals in Mein Kampf. Some historians assert that Britain and France could have stopped Hitler in 1936 by aiding loyalist Spain before Germany was fully rearmed, but neither country was willing to risk war. The devastation of World War I, combined with the all-awareness of the destructive power of modern technology, made the idea of more fighting unbearable. Unfortunately, when war came, it proved to be even more horrendous than anyone had imagined. Have a good day. God bless.